Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
Okay. Welcome to the studying, comrades. Today we are continuing on with our read of Gearld Horne's Counter-Revolution of 1776. We are on chapter 4 of this. They say, depending on how things go this month, it might be our last read on the channel. We'll see. I do want to continue, but I can't spend so much extra time. So if it is, it's a good one to end on. I will just say. We're on chapter 4 of this, so if you're following along, that's going to be page 88, I think, when it's the numbered page 88. If you're on a PDF, it might come up as page 103, though, depending on the PDF you're using. Yeah, I spoke about it the other day, Radisby. Yeah. It's just I gotta spend, the problem with it, like, I love doing the reading for everybody. I really do. The problem is that it takes so much time off of stream to prepare for them for me. And then cutting it out and all of that as well is all on top of that also. Even if I read just for YouTube, it could potentially be an easier situation. I don't know. It's just like I say, I'm trying to, my partner, like, not just looking things up, but like before I'm ready to read this to you all, like I can't just read out of nowhere. I've read this chapter this morning already. I essentially need to read this twice every time. And then plus I need to cut out the read afterwards, I need to edit it, and then I need to put it on YouTube. So it's just that it takes a lot of time, and it seems like every time I read, the numbers while we read go down, unfortunately. So I would like to continue, but it's just not, yeah. And the other thing is I gotta spend my spare time, instead of reading this, instead of like reading and preparing for this and stuff, I could be doing more to like help my fiance earn that CPAP. So that's kind of where I was at with that. But anyway, if it is, this is a really good last read for us. It's the culmination. Building a white pro-slavery wall. The construction of Georgia. The drum was pounding and the words were flowing with like insistency. No, they do the opposite every time I read. Even now, we just went from 30 to 20 by the time I'm starting this read. Every time. I don't know. It's just not popular. And I mean, the thing, and again, for me, it's not even that. Like, even if we didn't have that high view numbers, that's fine. It's that I'm spending so much other time preparing and all this stuff when I could be, again, helping my fiance. Like, that time I've spent reading this morning, I could have potentially found a little cash job and done like a tire job or like a brake job for somebody for some cash. I don't know. It's just stuff I gotta consider because I feel bad not being able to help out more when she's working at the vet thing. While I'm on disability, I can still do a little bit here and there, like fix people's cars, I guess. Okay. Anyway, I digress. I won't bore you with my personal thoughts. Well, What I get like knowing what everybody else is thinking about it too is good, but yeah, I know. I'm sure you all don't want to hear so much about it. Okay, so yeah, I got that too, Ridisby, which is why I can't just read off the cuff. I have to read this first because I would be such a mess just reading this like just out of the blue without having read this chapter first. It would not be good. The drum was pounding and the words were flowing with like insistency. It was November 1733 in St. Augustine, in Spanish Florida, which had long since gained a justified reputation as a scourge of colonies to the north. Notably, the Carolinas, from which the enslaved were fleeing in ever growing numbers southward, where they often wound up in Madrid's military, eager to inflict mayhem on their former captors. But now, an edict was being read, and pulsating rhythms thought to be favored by Africans. It just so happened that Carolina ships with Africans on board were in the harbor, which proclaimed that His Catholic Majesty himself was promising liberty and protection to all slaves that deserted to his realm. Supposedly, measures were taken to ensure that this seditious message would receive a wide audience. It did not take long before Carolinians began to condemn the reality of the steady stream of Africans fleeing southward, some committing murders, quote, and other mischief in their wake. There was a daily desertion, it was announced in 1738, which meant the decrease of Carolinians, produce of rice and naval stores, which was the product wholly of these slaves. This edict, it was said forebodingly, was intended to cause an insurrection of slaves at the same time, causing them to massacre their masters and then to desert, an eventuality that did occur. This was all devastating news for Carolina's settlers, though not unexpected since the Spaniards had long been seeking to unseat them, with Madrid's appeal to the enslaved as a major weapon. Actually, on the 12th of April 1731, the Council for the Indies in Madrid had arrived at a similar decision as that of 1733. And decades before that, Africans fleeing the Carolinas often found sanctuary in Florida. By mid 1728, Carolinas were groaning about Florida harboring all our runaway Negroes, quote unquote, which meant a new way of sending our own slaves against us to rob and plunder us. They are continually fitting out parties of Indians from St. Augustine to murder our white people. These indigenes were sometimes joined with Negroes, quote unquote. Then the dastardly Spaniards had promised 30 pieces of 8 per head for every live Negro, unquote, delivered from Carolina, incentivizing the greed
I've got
of
some
the
literature in my
ascending
car that will
capitalists.
change your whole way of thinking.
Sup,
Hey,
Larry?
Potate.
Chat. Potate 14. Hey, we talking colonialism?
Hey, yes, we're reading Gearld Horne, Counter-Revolution of 1776. Welcome in, Potate King. And thank you so much for your subscription. Very much appreciate that. Then the dastardly Spaniards had promised, quote, 30 pieces of 8 per head for every live Negro, end quote, delivered from Carolina, incentivizing the greed of the ascending capitalists, turning slavery against itself. By 1737, Spanish depredation in the Caribbean, including stealing Africans away from British possessions. Somehow, Londoners and mainland planters infrequently paused to consider why it was that the enslaved were fleeing Carolina for Florida, and not vice versa. Some Carolinians had barely unpacked their bags from Barbados in 1686 when they were set upon by invading Spaniards and contingents that included Africans, which led to the seizing and carting away of even more Africans. As early as 1713, it was mandated by the Carolina authorities that vessels, quote, shall cruise between Port Royal and St. Augustine on the lookout for fleeing Africans and advance contingents of Africans from St. Augustine. But the labyrinth of waterways of the vicinity could not easily foil the determination to become runaways. The settler assault on St. Augustine in 1719 was one of a number of attempts to eradicate this perceived beehive of sedition. As early as 1721, officialdom expressed mordaunt concern about South Carolina. The frequent massacres at the instigation of the French and Spaniards were worrisome, while the manufacturers of pitch and tar meant an increase in the number of black slaves, who had lately attempted and were very near succeeding in a new revolution, which would probably have been attended by the utter extirpation of all British subjects on this province. More military force was needed, no change there, but there was no answer as to where they would be commandeered. No time should be lost, it was demanded, since fortifications were but very few, which could mean not only Carolina, but Virginia too could be lost. St. Augustine was continuing menace, all of which demonstrated the danger faced by London subjects. Surrender was not an option given the importance of pitch and tar to reducing reliance on the same commodity from the Baltic region, which had its own challenges, not least potential threats to London itself. But likewise, threatening was the continuing problem of mainlanders, with thoughts of setting up manufacturers of their own, interfering with those of the motherland, not to mention, quote, carrying on an illegal trade with foreigners, particularly the stalwart forces that were France and Spain. In September 1725, Charleston leaders found themselves debating once more their counterparts in St. Augustine about the failure to return escaped Africans, with Madrid's men willing to negotiate both the price but insisting that Africans must remain, quote unquote. This was an order. It was announced pretentiously from His Catholic Majesty himself. Dumbfounded Carolinians insisted, to no avail, that these Africans were good and estates of themselves, and the Spaniards were engaged in robbing. But their pleas were ignored, for it was Madrid that thought that London's colonists were the interlopers. Spaniards had formulated elaborate claims to territory north of Florida, claimed by the British. London's colonial project in the Americas already was floundering, with Jamaicans on the warpath, mainland settlers consorting with the French, Africans rebelling aboard ships, then on the ground, and now Spaniards were threatening the Achilles heel of the mainland in the Carolinas, with a tempting Virginia not far distant. Hey, Workers' Pulse, welcome in. Thus, it was thought that when in September 1739, the Africans in South Carolina erupted in what came to be called Stono's Revolt, one of the bloodier episodes in mainland colonial history, the Spaniards had advanced further on the road of destabilizing their colonial competitor to the north. This was a contributing factor to a simmering conflict between London and Madrid, which overflowed in the following decade. Then came to a combustible boil during the 1756-1763 war, which turned out to be a catastrophic victory for the British, weakening their European competitors as it emboldened their now liberated mainland colonists to revolt in 1776. Yet, even before the pounding of drums of 1733 and the bloodlust of 1739, Madrid had revealed its intention not only by enticing Africans southward from Catalonia, but by forming a regiment of them, appointing officers from among them, allowing them the same pay and clothing them in the same uniform as the regular Spanish soldiers. It is probable that some Catalonians perceive this as little more than racial perfidy, or even a violation of the laws of war. The danger to the mainland colonies provided by Spanish Florida was a preoccupation with the founding father of Georgia, James Oglethorpe, whose colony was founded in 1733 in the midst of Catalonia turmoil due north. He was no stranger to the perils brought by slavery, having served as a leader of the Royal African Company, perhaps a reason why he sought to block slavery in Georgia, as this commerce was growingly being driven by the RAC competitors, private traders. In 1732, he opined that given the proportion of Negroes in South Carolina, this colony would be in great danger of being lost in case of a war with Spain or France. No worries, Worker Pulse. I don't think my bot actually times you out. He just warns you that he's going to time you out. I just don't allow anybody who's not a subscriber to post bot. It's just that's the way I can set the rule up, so I just have it set so anybody who's not a subscriber can't post links. It's just a little protection option I have enabled. I think your subscription must have expired. Your subscription must have expired. You do not have a kitty beside your name. You were missing the kitty. But you do have the badge. The badge is your cheer badge. The kitty is the subscription badge. No worries, comrade. Appreciate your support. A mod can grab your link. I just really want to read because I got till page 110. We're on page 91 right now. No kitty, no linky. Yeah. Thus, he thought there was a felt need to strengthen their neighborhood with large supplies of free men, meaning Europeans. In 1733, he announced that South Carolina had 40,000 Africans, worth at least £1 million of pounds sterling. But poor Europeans might be a substitute for enslaved Africans, in Georgia, with the added bonus that, unlike Negroes, they could be found useful against the Spaniards. Oglethorpe had cause to seek an alternative to bonded African labor. During the tempestuous era, a Londoner denounced the tragical accounts of plots and insurrectionists among the Negroes, which were so inimical to the interests of settlers. Acknowledged freely was the unavoidable point that the harsh maltreatment of this bonded labor force gave them the incentive to revolt. The yoke the Negroes wear, it was asserted, will render them more exquisitely sensible to the charms of liberty, and this disproportion may encourage them to form plots. Always lurking as a threat was collaboration between Africans and indigenes, not a minor consideration on the southeast coast of the mainland. as the Yamasee War had shown quite recently. Yeah, I like that. I like that. I like that. That quote there as well, Dorian. Nonetheless, despite the apprehension about the obvious danger provided by the increased presence of Africans, they continued to arrive in droves in South Carolina. A development that made all the more unlikely Oglethorpe's dream of a white pro slavery wall in Georgia, berefit of Africans. Almost 2,000 Africans were brought to South Carolina during the period stretching from September 1725 to September 1726, with annual importations doubling over the next decade. A typical occurrence took place in May 1735. The Carolina merchant Samuel Everleigh arranged for a ship from Angola to arrive in his homeland with 318 enchained Africans on board. Even more were expected shortly from Guinea, and even more from elsewhere on the beleaguered continent. Of the 318, virtually all were sold within 2 days, suggestive of the insatiable demand for slaves. Vainly, there was an accompanying call for a good number of whites to balance them, quote unquote. But this seemed more like a self-deluding poppycock than anything else. The exhilarating competition between the RAC and the private traders had done its dirty work so devastatingly that even London itself, by 1731, was having to confront a growing population of Africans. A concurrence that eventuated in the earth-shaking Somerset's case of 1772, and further reason to revolt on the mainland in 1776. The number of Africans in the North Atlantic region was growing mightily, with little contemplation of the downside consequences. Even in New Hampshire, not renowned as a site of African presence, by the 1730s, Negro slaves had become a sign of social status, as evidenced by their increasingly widespread usage, and the skyrocketing growth in these numbers more than doubling during this decade. Of course, it was London that often sought to block taxes on Africans imported to the mainland, or at least to have these imports paid by mainland buyers rather than Bristol merchants, which inflamed some settlers, not necessarily on abolitionist grounds, but on the basis of the metropolis's casual disregard for the havoc that could be wrought by a growing number of Africans, and the Crown's apparent indifference to the same. Yet, despite the danger signals, Carolina elites were reluctant to relent. In March 1734, a lengthy analysis moaned about the, quote, intestine dangers from the great number of Negroes that were now among them. The Negroes were 3-to-1 of all the Crown's white subjects in this province. Insurrections, it was concluded morosely, have often been attempted, and would at any time prove fatal if the French should instigate them, unquote. That same year, legislators mandated that patrols were required to search and, if necessary, break open all Negro houses and to take away any guns, swords, or weapons found there, unquote. Though how such contraband reached Africans was left unsaid. There were compelling reasons, in other words, to bar Africans altogether, particularly slaves from Georgia, creating a presumed white wall of impenetrability blocking the militant thrust from Spanish Florida, forming a catchment basin to ensnare fleeing Africans from Charleston, while placing more pressure on the presumed source of the problem, St. Augustine. Intimidating the rich prize that was Cuba, the strategically sited island that patrolled the approaches to the mainland, and the wealthy Spanish colony that was Mexico, was also a relevant consideration. No appearance of slavery, not even in Negroes, quote, was to be allowed. It was said of Georgia by the colony's founder, with emphasis in 1733, while at the same time, it was to be a blow in the ongoing religious Cold War, serving as a refuge for fleeing Protestants from France and Eastern Europe particularly, which also served to enhance the developing and potent category that was whiteness. Yet, if bolstering whiteness was at issue in Georgia, the barring of Africans simultaneously suggested that this important category had been insufficiently theorized. For the absence of Africans would serve to allow class and ethnic tensions among Europeans to fester, replicating Europe on the mainland, which was not exactly the goal of many colonizers. So Mexico, they were, however, Dorian, as Horne was pointing out earlier in this work, at the same time, both the Spanish and the French were finding it more and more necessary to arm black slaves and free, and even in instances offer like slaves, like if you fight in this war against the British or whatever, then we will grant you your freedom. Basically, you serve as a militia and we will make you a free man. Like there were certain things like this going on in Spain and the French, which, as Horne points out, is what Africans and indigenous people were sort of taking advantage of. They were still using enslaved labor, but there was a rising tide of calls to abolish it. Well, which was frustrated with them arming African and indigenous slaves and using them as militia against the British. And then of course you have, as part of that problem, you have Britain becoming terrified of the prospect of their slaves, joining with and being armed by the Spanish or the French, and then turning against the English as well. So they sort of saw it as like a conspiracy against themselves also, the Americans, which is like the counter-revolution is sort of like a reaction to that, right? It wasn't that they wanted independence from the British, it's that the British were threatening their slave trade. Because the British saw that the slave trade was threatening their hegemony as an empire. It was like all these contradictions just tied up into this big knot, right? Banning Africans would mean that Europeans would have to perform tasks they might not otherwise, while being bossed, perhaps menaced, by other Europeans. Adding enslaved Africans, on the other hand, meant that brute agricultural labor could be assigned to a degraded dark fork, which would bolster certain Europeans up the class ladder and enrich others. Yet, bringing bonded African labor to Georgia, which is what eventually happened, would simply mean extending Carolina's problems closer to St. Augustine. Except it would be worse than there before, for Georgia would be easier to overrun than Carolina, being weaker and closer to Florida. Hence, the so-called Negro Act of 1735 explicitly barred slavery in Georgia, since bitter experience had convinced settlers that it was only Europeans who alone can, in case of a war, be relied for defense and security. Any settlers so audacious as to employ Africans in Georgia were to be fined. The fright in the region may have been so pervasive that few settlers bothered to deconstruct what was meant by white. For as Georgia was being formed in 1730, Oglethorpe discovered that among his troops were some who had served previously for His Catholic Majesty, and others who were Roman Catholic, and ipso facto suspect, that they disclaimed allegiance to London and confessed to espionage with the aim of exciting a mutiny in the ranks only served to increase religious come national hostility. Bop, where are ya? Orgelthrop was forced to then foil an assassination plot against himself. The bullet whizzed by his shoulder, leaving a scorch mark on his uniform. With the nervous elite in South Carolina recognizing belatedly the danger they had created. In 1737, they devised the Negro Fund, which was a tax on imports of Africans to be used for relief of the poor Protestants who had arrived lately from Europe with intent to settle. They quickly discovered, however, that collecting this impost from Negro merchants and factors was not easy, leading to many unsuccessful calls, made thereupon to the great disappointment of such poor Protestants. Unquote. Of course, this reinforced and accelerating a pre-existing pattern that was not to disappear after the establishment of the post-1776 Republic, burdening Africans in order to relieve Europeans in a way that frustrated class struggle across racial lines. I'm going to leave you with that while I go fill my water. Right quick. I think that sentence is important enough, and too many class reductionists around the internet. I'll leave you right here with this highlighted while I just fill my water for 1 second.
The revolution that feeds the children gets my support.
Fuck the demagogues! I hear yes. And of course, the important thing about this is an important thing to understand about racial lines and
I would have been friends with Stalin.
and race is that it's not necessarily an ethnic category, right? Race, and although racial, it's a social construct, it is at the same time a political category, right? Which is why Marxists who deny a racial intersectional analysis along with their class analysis are being unscientific, because race is a political category. Anyway, allow me to continue. This idea that Africans, despite the outsized wealth they created, were more of a hassle than a bounty was not unique to Carolina. Suggestive of how the security threat they posed was becoming a common concern. As Georgia was taking off as a refuge solely for Europeans, a New Yorker concurred that honest, useful, and laborious white people were the truest riches and surest strength that could be provided, as opposed to the disadvantages that attended the too great importation of Negroes. Unquote. When established in the 17th century, South Carolina had been hailed as not only one of the largest of London's colonies on the mainland, but a site of synergy, given its relative proximity to Jamaica, Barbados, and the emerging sugar colonies, thought by many observers to be more valuable still. But the worm had turned, and now, given Carolina's proximity to Florida and Cuba, it was emerging as a vital threat to the entire colonial enterprise in the Americas that London had so assiduously maintained. This was particularly so given the utter turmoil that was coming to characterize the Caribbean and the Atlantic. Thus, in order to comprehend why a colony in Georgia was necessary, once more, it is necessary to comprehend trends in the waters surrounding the mainland. The point is that the formation of Georgia was not only a response to intercolonial conflict with Spain and Florida and Cuba, it was also a response to growing rebelliousness of Africans in Jamaica and Antigua particularly. This restiveness suggested that these valuable islands could be lost forever, necessitating a redeployment of capital and managerial talent to the mainland. Fortifying the mainland by constructing a white pro-slavery wall in Georgia was the response. In 1718, nautical miles away from Carolina and Bermuda, indigenes said to be Cherokee were causing an uproar. It was said that they had made inhabitants very apprehensive, since they were said to have collaborating with the Negroes. Many already had run away from their masters in the woods, into the woods, and there was an incisive fear that this was a prelude to the antagonists seeking to invade them. As Georgia was just getting started, word came from the Bahamas of an intended insurrection of Negroes there. As Africans were often valuable commodities, and exiling them was often a remedy for their sedition, it became harder to contain epidemics of unrest. Already there was grumbling from Antigua about the decline of British trade in Africans by dint of importations from Dutch territories. There were a prodigious number of quote-unquote prodigious number of Negroes brought to St. Christopher's. It was reported in 1726 from St. Eustace's. What was going on in the region was symptomatic of the disastrous triumph brought by the increase in slave trading in the aftermath of 1688. For between this crucial date and 1707, Nevis, St. Christopher's, Antigua, and Montserrat had a similar experience with enslaved Africans, who once had constituted a minority or bare majority of the population, but by the end of this era were surging to clear majorities of up to 80%, with predictable, devastating consequences for the life expectancy of the settlers. Yeah, Rob, we even watched Breakthrough. I said this morning when we were doing the news, we even watched Breakthrough News, and we even watched Breakthrough News, and we watched Geopolitical Economy Report, who both seem to like suggest in a very weird, un-Marxist, like unscientific way that somehow Biden was any better than Trump in a very strange like way. After like stating that they're both pretty much identical, but then still like hinting at that. Thankfully, Electric Intifada came along and showed everybody how it's supposed to be done on media, as far as that goes. So check out my news. If you check out my VOD later, be sure to check out the news section. Simultaneously, Africans were fleeing Barbados for Martinique, though it was felt they were being poached improperly. The RAC had reason to think it was the private traders up to their old tricks, For in 1726, this now withering body sought to prevent the carrying off of any Negroes, Indians, or mulatto slaves, and to inflict exemplary punishment upon masters of ships who did so, particularly those who had been accused of clandestinely making off with Barbados slaves. Unquote. Perhaps these slaveholders should have left well enough alone, thankful that Africans with possibly felon in their hearts were fleeing. For it was also in 1726 that the governor in St. Christopher's traveled to neighboring Nevis, having been told there was an intended insurrection of the Negroes there to destroy all the inhabitants. 2 of the accused were executed, which may not have been the best antidote to quell the anger of those remaining Africans. Per usual in the colonies, sharp contention had emerged from enemies from without and the Negro slaves within, unquote, requiring the urgent dispatching of 2 companies of soldiers. Though if they had come from Barbados or Antigua, or even parts of the mainland, these colonies too would have been dangerously exposed to unrest. The Crown was forced to enact untenable measures to confront this threat. For example, mandating that all vessels trading near these disputous islands should have no more than 25% passengers and crew of African ancestry. Otherwise, the vessel shall be forfeited. But this could empower unduly European laborers to the detriment of grandees, necessitating concessions to the former. These concessions ultimately took the form of Herrenvolk democracy and its close relative, right-wing populism. Yeah, imagine getting less angry when they murder your family and friends. Yeah, when they murder your fighters. Yeah, that as the case we see with Palestine, that famously just cools the resistance off, right? London had constructed a colonial problem for itself, the dimensions of which were often dimly realized. For the Caribbean colonies had far-reaching difficulties, beyond the obvious unforgiving racial ratios. In 1733, a commentator observed that in Hispaniola, planters could go directly to foreign markets, facilitating hemispheric gains, while London's colonies had to trade through the metropolis. Then, as one dour commentator observed, there were 2 frequent hurricanes, accidental fire that could easily consume crops, high mortality among the Negroes, deteriorating soil, for sugar is the only thing of worth that his soil is capable of producing, and no timber. And to complete our unhappy situation, we are every moment in time of war to be devoured by the enemies of our mother nation, often aided by the slaves who are really our enemies. New England was a true Frankenstein monster, building up France and Spain while Caribbean colonies could disappear at any moment. Though these complaints about the colonies were directed at both the mainland and the Caribbean, at least as of 1733-32, the latter seemed more valuable, though the risk of African insurrection and the collapse and total loss was probably greater. For it was then that one analysis detected that British exports to the Caribbean were vastly greater than the exports of the like manufacturers to New England. Likewise, imports from the West Indies were greater than those of New England. If this were so, then why should London strain the Esquire to accommodate mainland colonies that seemed to be destined for independency in any case? This suggested that the present advantage, if there be such, of New England to Great Britain must decline, and ultimately its value will be quite lost to London, through independency or otherwise. Surely the racial ratios in the Caribbean severely limited dreams of succession from the crown, making settlers there more dependent on redcoats than were their counterparts on the mainland. If trade were barred between British North America and the French Caribbean, which was how a proper colonialism should operate, major gains to London would accrue, while simultaneously injuring the eternal foe across the Channel. This improper tie between the mainland and France was also thought to strengthen Paris's interests in the all-important African market. Similarly, said one Londoner, by encouraging our sugar settlements, it will necessarily follow that there will be a greater call for Negroes, unquote, which mainland trade with the French was objectively blocking. As of this writing, 1731, mainland ships were landing in Jamaica, and after selling their loading for money, they carried it to Hispaniola and purchased molasses. That before this trade, the price of slaves at Jamaica were not half the price they had been since, unquote. Besides, money was being made in Boston from lumber that really were His Majesty's pine trees. But instead, this capital was flowing to Boston merchants, with a dubious conception of patriotism. Repeatedly, and mostly without tangible results, London condemned illicit trade between New England and the French. But it was difficult to move with determined purpose when disunity reigns, and such was the case in London. For with equal intensity, there were those who felt the mainland colonies were, quote, of much greater importance than the sugar islands, unquote. In summary, both the mainland and the Caribbean colonies presented tough problems for London. The former were thought to be easing towards independency, while simultaneously these presumed moochers were draining the Esquire in order to prevent conquest by Spain or France, or the indigenous in league with the Africans. While the Caribbean Isles, though valuable, faced a challenge that was probably more formidable given the forbidding racial ratios. A gauge of mind-bending instability brought by what was probably the most vexing problem, Africans, can be measured by the continuous unease about slavery expressed in the metropolis. In 1730, the Bishop of London expressed shock about the high mortality rate of Africans in Barbados. Out of their stock of 80,000, there die every year 5,000 Negroes, more than are born in that island. In effect, this people is under a necessity of being entirely renewed every 16 years. Emphasis original. The 16 years part. Inevitably, he thought, this meant alarming insurrections of the slaves, now lately at Montserrat, which were merciful warnings of that just temporal vengeance, which in all probability would overtake settlers. The sword has swung over their heads by a very slender thread, he warned. For in the region there were 230,000 Negro slaves, and upon the highest calculation, probably too high in retrospect, the Europeans amounted to 90,000 souls, which suggested how they were endangered both from within and without, to the assaults of a foreign enemy and to the insurrection of their own slaves. Yet, for the sake of a little private gain, actually a lot in retrospect, enslavement by the colonist persisted rather than the employment of certain proportion of white servants, making the tenure of his life and possessions thereby daily more and more precarious. As if these events were not nerve-wracking enough, Mainland settlers then had to contend with typically dispiriting news from Jamaica. This was no minor matter, for this colony, London's largest in the Caribbean, was seen as vital to all others. It could pose a challenge to Cuba and Hispaniola, not to mention Cartagena, and the price of Africans determined there could influence the whole region. Typically, private traders and their competitors were competing vigorously in this regard, with the former underselling the latter, 80 to 120 pieces of 8 per head, whereas the company sells from 250 to 300 pieces of 8. Was the conclusion in 1728. The general commercial spin-off from being a slave trade emporium, visiting merchants with bulging wallets ready to spend on food, lodging, and hospitality, was sufficiently attractive to make Jamaica a handsome prize. The problem for London was that the Africans refused to cooperate with this scenario. In 1716, His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, was informed that this colony was in dangerous state and almost defenseless, and that the number of white people, again curiously undefined, needed an increase to prevent any insurrection of the Negroes. Unquote. By 1718, complaints emerged from this mountainous island about rebellious and runaway slaves, who formed themselves into several parties, and of late have very much increased, while the presumed magic bullet, several laws, proved ineffectual. Ominously, some of these former slaves had departed Jamaica for French and Spanish colonies nearby with unclear intentions. Matters had not improved by 1724, as a result of losses occasioned by pirates or rebellious Negroes, with again more settlers sought as a palliative. By 1728, there was hysteria that Jamaica, with its commodious situation for trade, and its many good harbors and bays, had become an attractive nuisance, in great danger of being invaded, in case of any rupture between Great Britain and France or Spain. By 1730, there was worry about the dangers that arise from disguised as well as declared papists, who could easily arrive in Jamaica, given the desperation for a larger white presence. Yet, the bar on Catholic presence had served to discourage Protestants too, which, as the number of white inhabitants are few, may be a very bad consequence. Unquote. Barring bad consequence indeed was the motive behind attempts in 1730 to prevent the selling of powder to rebellious or any other Negroes whatsoever, as this tends to increase their numbers, meaning their robbing and plundering of the remote parts of the island to the greater discouragement of new settlements. By 1733, Jamaican settlers seemed on the verge of surrendering the entire enterprise to the rebellious and runaway slaves, whose population had greatly increased and become more formidable in the northeast, northwest, and southwest parts of this island, to the great terror of His Majesty's subjects, who had suffered by the frequent robberies, murders, and depredations committed by Africans. Soon it was expected that the western parts of the island will soon become the seat of an intestine war, as well as the eastern. The Africans had devised considerable settlements of their own, causing Europeans to flee, to the great prejudice and diminution of His Majesty's revenues. A hefty bounty was to be awarded to any settler so bold as to kill or take alive these rebels, except where it shall be judged necessary to execute them, as an example and terror to others. Thus, each barrack was to be duly provided with a sufficient gang of dogs for unsavory purposes. As of 1734, Africans were in open revolt. Planters were scurrying away in every direction, and there was a fear that the rebellious spirit of Jamaica was spreading to neighboring islands. London was bracing for a possible invasion of the island by one of the nearby powers, probably Spain, and the colonists pleaded for reinforcements with little heed of the danger that all the other colonies may face if they were denuded of troops. By July 1734, Richard Hemmings, of the Assembly of Jamaica, was embodying this trend, as he thought that to dispose of the estate here would be the best thing. Why? The insecurity of our country, he told his aunt in London, occasioned by our slaves in rebellion against us, whose insolence is grown so great. Unquote. The was leading to a collapse of the colony. The miasma of fear was such that, he continued, we are not sure of another day, for robberies and murders so common on our roads that it is with utmost hazard that we travel them. For the methods hitherto taken to suppress them have been attended with unsuccess, and so vast an expense that I can safely say that 2/3 of the inhabitants are already ruined. For decades, the settlers had been unleashing lethal force against the Maroons, forced to arm the whole colony. It was said in 1740, everyone began to despair when this offensive proved unavailing. This occurred despite inhumane cruelties wielded against these bumptious Africans. These runaways endured more near the space of a century. It was said with wonder, than can be found on record of any state or people. What the hell? No, no worries. I'm starting to stumble over my words because I've said about, I'm gonna watch her numbers. Just side note, watching her numbers fall from like 30 to 20 while doing this reading is not encouraging for me. Okay, I just noticed this though to the corner of my eye when I went to go look at this Amazon Prime thing. What the fuck is up with Yugopnik's title today? What the fuck? Yes, let's objectify women as a title. That seems good. Hot Sister Haver talking about Project 2025 is the first part of his title. I'm gonna go ahead and unfollow now. Hot Sister Haver. We can dehumanize, we can make fun of Ben. We can fucking make fun of Ben Shapiro without objectifying a woman, without objectification. There's nothing wrong with being a hot sister, but damn. Yeah, no, I gathered that. Oh, I don't care for right-wing content either, but I mean, first of all, what does Ben Shapiro's like? What did Ben Shapiro's sister have to do with it? First of all, anyway, I just feel like we can like dehumanize Ben. We can dehumanize and make fun of Ben Shapiro without this like weird focus on his sister. I'm sorry, but it's just real bro energy to me. She also sucks for what it's worth. Okay, but I mean, still, to me, when you feel the need to like, sexualize and objectify a woman because they suck, you're still objectifying somebody for being a woman, right? Like, I don't know. I still find it like a bit weird. It's like they're still, especially like as a leftist, it's like, are we not against objectification of like women in general, I thought? Right? Don't we want to combat that? We got like 10 pages left of this read. We're getting close. I just need to stretch my lips. Okay. Sorry for that diversion, I just noticed. I mean, yeah, there is a weird, I guess, but at the same time, I don't know. I just find it's like, if you're a leftist, it's a weird thing for me to like to get into that. It was like the same thing with like Nancy Reagan a while ago, if y'all remember that. All right, I'm gonna continue the read here. We're almost done, and then we'll get to the thing. Yeah, the throat goat thing. Yeah, exactly, exactly. Like, there's nothing wrong with that, you know? It's always that's hot. Yeah. It's just bro, I don't know. There's a certain cringe tinge with misogyny and bro jokes that just, I don't know. All right, I will continue. For decades, the settlers had been unleashing lethal force against the Maroons. Forced to arm the whole colony, it was said in 1740. Everyone began to despair when this offensive proved unavailing. This occurred despite inhumane cruelties wielded against these bumptious Africans. These runaways endured more near the space of the century. It was said with wonder than can be found on record of any state of people. Yeah, well, I mean, I got I get the context of it. It's just like I saw, and that context isn't so much a problem as much as the way certain people engaged with that context, if you know what I mean. They're not not like the core of the joke, not the irony itself, but the way people crafted their jokes surrounding that irony, which became cringe and in some instances, I would say misogynistic, right? Or even like sexually like repressive in their own mind, in their own senses. Yeah, dudes being bros it's just a serious problem in general, okay? And the problem, and I say like the problem with deprogram podcast for me more than anything else is just that dude bro energy is so is just it's so cringe to me. I can't watch it. Like, ugh. It's like high. It just feels like I'm back at like high school or something. I'm like, I'm nearly 40. I just like don't. I have no desire for that high schoolish like. I don't know. It's so cringe to me, the bro shit. The African known as Cudjoe and the Maroons he was said to represent embodied the runaway fears of settlers. History seemed to be repeating itself. For the Maroons, who had so bedeviled the Spaniards in 1655 to the point that they contributed to Madrid's loss of the entire island, were now seemingly engaged in a repeat performance, but with London this time as the victim. Cudjoe was thought to be aligned with a group known as the Madagascars, suggestive of the expansive geographical reach of the ever-broadening slave trade. Finally, a treaty was brokered with these rebels in early 1738, as Maroon settlements were given de facto, if not de jure, diplomatic recognition. But what kind of signal did this send to nearby Africans, not to mention the Spaniards, who might deduce that aligning with Africans suffering under the Union Jack could be a wise course? Just as Madrid's surrender of Gibraltar to London was a telling sign of the correlation of the forces between the two powers, the treaty between the Maroons and Jamaica and the Crown and the surrender of territory it mandated was an indication that British rule on this valuable island might not be eternal. And if Jamaica could be threatened by Africans, what did that mean for other possessions? Was the rise of the Maroons and the de facto abolition they represented simply a sign that the wiser policy was a crown-directed abolition rather than a helter-skelter retreat in the face of angry Africans? Perhaps in alliance with competing European powers? Would not the latter policy embody an even bigger loss than the state-mandated abolition? The naysayers disagreed. The treaty with the Maroons was deemed by some as a humiliation for London and a victory for Captain Cudjoe and his compatriots, who were, it was said, to be in a perfect state of freedom, not the kind of signal to send to a labor force based on brute coercion. Still, London could rest comfortably that it would escape the fate handed to Spain in 1655 in Jamaica, since the Maroons had agreed that, in case this island be invaded by any foreign enemy, the said Captain Cudjoe and his successors would fight alongside the Redcoats. No wonder London's critics were furious. The concessions wrung from the Maroons was their pledge to kill Europeans, and even that could not be guaranteed. For Captain Cudjoe could just as easily betray London and ally with Madrid or Paris. The situation, in short, was dicey for London and Jamaica. Would the rich colony be abandoned? What if the Spanish, in particular, worked out an entente with remaining Africans? After all, Madrid had ruled that just decades earlier. What might that mean for the overall balance of the region? Blah, that was a tongue twister. I'm gonna say that part again. After all, Madrid had ruled there just decades earlier. What might that mean for the overall balance in the region? Maroons were said to be in touch with Spaniards in neighboring Cuba, offering to invite their return on condition that their own freedom was guaranteed. When London dispatched 2 regiments from Gibraltar to bolster its deteriorating presence in the region, it may have occurred to Madrid to pounce on this colony, on what was thought to be its land, and punish the British further by aligning with the Maroons. Thus, did prudence then dictate London downsizing in the Caribbean and fortifying the mainland? But would that not play into the hands of mainland colonies that were already leaning towards independency? And if London were forced to abandon Jamaica, what did that portend for the slavery project in the Americas as a whole? London was trapped in a maze of irreconcilable contradictions. Though the elongated response was building a white pro-slavery wall in Georgia, which could protect colonies to the north, while menacing competing colonial powers to the south. Perhaps, if the problem for colonialism could be localized in Jamaica, the wound that Maroons had begun to inflict decades earlier could be isolated and cauterized there. But such was not to be. For in 1733, 1734, Africans of the Danish Caribbean revolted with substantial military success over a period of months, endangering the entire colonial enterprise. In 1729, a murderous plot of the enslaved was exposed in Antigua. But it was in 1736 that an island-wide conspiracy of the Africans was uncovered there, which was the accumulation of what had been a riotous spate of unrest since the slave trade reforms decades earlier. For the enslaved intended to take the entire island and extirpate the European settlement. London should not have been overly surprised, for as early as 1666, the problem of fugitive slaves had become so rampant that fear was cascading through the settlement. Yet the quandary for the colonists was crystallized when, after 1729 tumult, the accused Africans were banished to the northern colonies, where they could continue their mischief. The banishment also exposed the colonial dilemma. Since simply executing rebellious Africans was problematic given their value, while exiling them, often miles away from friends and familiar sites, would serve to alienate them further and would not necessarily convert the Africans left behind into pro-colonial advocates. The news from Antigua in 1736 was startling nevertheless. By this troublesome year, there was reportedly 3,000 Europeans and 24,000 Africans on the island. The latter were reputedly inspired by earlier turmoil of 1729, and the news of a similarly inspired revolt in the Danish Caribbean a few years later, when 40 Europeans were massacred. This gave impetus to the gathering idea that Africans were increasingly acting in concert, a message hard to ignore on the mainland, where the African population was growing steadily. That the 1736 plot came so close to fruition after a long gestation was likewise worrisome. If the trend of Africans acting in concert was on the uptick, despite the miles of ocean that separated them, then an impenetrable wall of white solidarity in Georgia was more desperately needed than first thought. The prominent Carolinian, Robert Pringle, a man with varied interests over a broadening expanse of territory, was certainly acting in concert, notably in early 1739, when he expressed frightful concern to a fellow European in St. Kitts about the great mortality of that island, and the not disconnected reality of his interlocutor being alarmed for fear of an insurrection of the Negroes. Likewise, Europeans, it was reported in Antigua in 1736, were to be murdered and a new form of government to be established by the slaves among themselves. There was concern that this execrable conspiracy must reach the knowledge of distant countries and probably be animadverted upon with severity. That is, reach the ears of the Spanish with a mutual interest in routing the British. Seeming regrets were expressed about the enslavement of Africans that was the root of this barely averted fiasco that led to 47 Africans executed on the 15th of December 1736. "We think it is our duty," said this mealy-mouthed analyst, "to advise our fellow subjects of Great Britain to consider that slavery is not our choice but necessity, it being impossible to carry on our sugar manufactures by white laborers." Unquote. A thesis then being challenged due north in Georgia. That this 1736 conspiracy was led by a valuable man, a master carpenter, known as Tomboy, was equally troubling. Born on the Gold Coast, his crew included reportedly Creoles of French parentage, with all being initiated into the Roman Catholic religion. A troubling sign in the midst of a religious Cold War, as was reputed French angle. The general tenor of the oath, it was announced tremendously, was to kill whites. An alleged cause illustrated the difficult straits of the colonial project. "We may say with certainty," said officialdom, "that the particular inducement to the slaves to set this plot on foot, next to the hope of freedom, was the inequality of numbers of white and black." Unquote. A discourse that emerged on the legality of the enslaved being white witness in court was the kind of development that would, simultaneously, enrage mainlanders, beginning to worry about London's allegiance to bondage. Antigua, 1736, was a paradigmatic event, informing one and all that colonies with overwhelming African majorities were unsustainable in the long run, thus hastening a redeployment of capital and personnel alike to the mainland, which in turn hastened the onset of the 1776 revolt. As tension hurtled northward, Abraham Redwood, born in Antigua in 1709, was present in 1736. Two of the chief conspirators were his slaves. Within months, he had sailed to the mainland, depositing his young family in Rhode Island, where, not coincidentally, the African population soon ballooned. Redwood became a major force in Newport, where the chief library today continues to carry his name, and where his contribution to what became the United States continues to be celebrated. What was happening was not only capital and managerial flight to the mainland in the face of a none-too-slumbering volcano in the Caribbean, but also moving the problem of slavery northward, which could only heighten the pace of change as Africans who had seen terror on the face of planters took up residence in North America. Thus, John Cleland, who had an Antigua plantation, applied to bring 120 Africans with him as he evacuated to South Carolina, which was not exactly a tranquil refuge for enslavement. He thought he could employ these laborers, much more to his advantage in Carolina, and compared to Antigua. This was probably accurate. Nevertheless, it was not good news for mainland Africans and their destiny that by the end of the 18th century, those arriving to form a new republic had been often driven to this point by the specter of and reality of Europeans being slain by the enslaved. It may have been worse news when, just as the authorities were sifting through the dire consequences of Antigua, they then had to contemplate requesting aid from the French governor of St. Martin's in order to suppress a rebellion of Negroes in St. Bartholomew's. Evidently, This was a plot that involved more than one island, since Anquilia Negroes went to join those in St. Martin's, unquote. And the colonizers felt compelled to cross boundaries in a similar manner. But if the perpetual foe in Paris had to be called upon for aid, then what was the point of intercolony rivalry and war? Given bloody revolt in the Caribbean, forming White Georgia can be seen as a way station by way of detour to abolition. That is, building a pro-slavery wall was the final and futile attempt to resolve the pulverizing dilemma delivered by mass employment of enslaved African labor. When White Georgia could not hold, conflicting and rupturing approaches were in order. Abolition crept ever closer in London, along with secession and doubling down on enslavement by settlers. Thus, the threat to stability said to be brought by enslaved Africans was so great that in 1736, even William Byrd, who became fabulously wealthy by dint of his avid participation in enslavement, was beginning to suspect that bringing more Africans to Virginia would only provide kindling for conflagration. In sum, by the 1730s, the suspicion was growing that slavery was morphing into a catastrophic success. That is, it had produced enormous riches and development while providing a huge opening for a stunning reversal of this model by way of African revolt, assisted by the indigenous, European foes, or both. Georgia was the response. The French are continually undermining us both in the West and East Indies, one Londoner proclaimed in 1733. And this latest province could act as a buffer, particularly if there was no appearance of slavery, not even in Negroes. But proclaiming a white colony was one thing, actualizing it was quite another. Put simply, how could Georgia compete with the gravitational pull exerted by slave labor on working conditions, not to mention compensation, while its competitors luxuriated in this form of bondage? The eminent settler Peter Gordon demanded enslaved Africans and dismissed European servants as the very scum and refuse of mankind, trained up in all sorts of vice, often loaded with bad distempers. Unquote. As early as 1735, one prominent settler was arguing that it was next to an impossibility to proceed with the original blueprint. The Europeans were unaccustomed to the hot climate and could not bear the scorching rays of the sun, quote unquote. There was a great deal of difference between the expense of the white servants and of Negroes, for Negroes can endure this climate without any clothes, yet another savings, whereas white men must be clothed. As for diet, it costs less to feed Africans. Europeans poor were generally intended for 4 or at most 5 years, while Africans were in bondage eternally. Frequent running away was easier for Europeans. Of course, said this settler, they did not intend to commit the error of Charleston and allow for a greater number of Africans, but excluding them altogether was ridiculous. Hey Rylan, welcome comrade. By late 1738, clamor for Africans continued to build, despite the inconveniences and mischiefs that accompanied their presence. Since colonists were past masters in the devious act of smuggling, barring Africans from Georgia would always be dubious in any case. Oglethorpe, the leading colonist, objected strenuously, warning bluntly that if Africans were to be allowed, this colony must be immediately destroyed, for it would be impossible to prevent them deserting to the Spaniards, who give freedom, land, and protection to all runaway Negroes, who then might return arms in hand bent on furious revenge. Right? Besides overturning Georgia's original reason for being would simply empower the Negro merchants, quote unquote, who delivered Africans and who had pensioned for flooding the market to the detriment and security, and who would then direct their ill-gotten gains to lands in the colony, thus eroding the fortunes of competing interests. They would pretend that there might be some limitation in numbers, it was announced perceptively, but limitations cannot be put into practice, as experience has proved in other countries. Carolina's problem, an African majority, could soon become Georgia's problem, thus maximizing the perils faced by mainland colonies as a whole. For in the run-up to Stono's revolt in September 1739, mainland Africans' imitation of their counterparts in Antigua 1736, the number of Africans in Carolina were increasingly heedlessly, as if there was not a price in blood to be paid. Carolinians were not alone in their innocence, for by 1734, colonists in Mobile and New Orleans were demanding more Africans, apparently oblivious to the threat to life and limb that their province seemed to promise. Often, they were getting them from Hispaniola, a frequent haunt for New Englanders, which suggested that these Gulf Coast Africans could soon wind up in Georgia or Carolina, given the flexible, fluid market in slaves. At the same time, the number of Africans in St. Augustine was rising correspondingly, as debacle was courted by English-speaking settlement. This London knew well, but the promise of holding vast colonial territory with the enchanting dreams of profit it pretended was sufficient to squash doubts. But how could London responsibly initiate a colony in Georgia under the nose of hostile Madrid, while its own colonists were bolstering this religious foe and colonial competitor? It would have been understandable if London viewed its colonists as ungrateful wretches, demanding expenditure to protect against rampaging indigenes and Africans, and European foes, while cutting deals with the latter in particular. Our sugar islands are in a declining condition, warned one Londoner in 1738, chiefly by the increase of the French settlements, buoyed by mainland treachery. If Caribbean colonies were weakened, the same fate could befall those on the mainland, which would then ricochet across the Atlantic to destabilize forts in Africa, which, like falling dominoes, could then endanger London itself. Yet, colonial planters wondered why they could not send their produce directly to buyers, as they continued to question the very essence of colonialism itself. Carolina's proximity to the Caribbean now meant it had, in many ways, become the guardian blocking the path to Virginia heading northward. Yet, simultaneously, this province was a growing African majority, was subject to the machinations of the burgeoning threat posed by Spanish Florida, and rampant instability in Jamaica. Georgia was the response, but was it sufficient even if the formidable obstacle of barring Africans could be attained? Probably not. Then there was the unstable situation in South Carolina itself. In late February 1733, a report was filed concerning several large companies of Negroes, meeting very lately at different places. 300 met on Sunday last, accompanied by frequent robberies, insolences, and unrestrained liberties of most slaves at this time. So far, so typical. But what was frightening was the perception that there was some plot on foot, destructive to His Majesty's subjects in this province. The alarm was sounded. No time may be lost to intercept and crush this looming danger. Africans, said the leading politicos, had committed many outrages and robberies, and lie in the swamp at the head of Wando River, where they bid defiance. To foil their resistance, it was deemed necessary to exercise military discipline, either by shooting them or otherwise. It was almost as if the settler population could be diagnosed clinically with an advanced state of paranoia. But as the saying goes, paranoids can have real enemies too. And such was the case for mainland settlers, confronted daily by rebellious Africans, determined to overturn the system they had been dragooned to build. When a free Negro arrived from Virginia with 7 Negroes of his own, he was greeted not with warmth as a class comrade, whose existence could reassure the enslavement of eternal drudgery, was not their destiny, but with suspicious investigation. Suspicious, not superstitious. And a shockingly clarifying moment in the immediate prelude to 1776, a similarly well-positioned African, Thomas Jeremiah, was executed by rebels in an unmistakable indicator that Africans generally would not be warmly embraced by the new republic. The equivalence between African and slave and African and foe continued to build, a sobering development and not a predictor of racial harmony on the mainland. I just need to fill my water one more time, and then we're on the last part of the read. This is a long chapter. One sec. Okay, water's filled. Hey Hash, welcome in. Great to see you, Comrade Hash Kush. Everybody follow Hash. Yes, I gotta hydrate. Okay, this is the last section right here. I think. What? Wait. Oh yeah, okay. Woo! It got a little scary there for a second. Okay. Virginia, which was to become... Oh, hi, Bug. You want to say hi to everybody before I continue to read? Huh? You want to say hi to the comrades? Oh, here's a Buggy. A Buggy to say hi. Bug. Are you sleepy, Buggy? You're a sleepy oh, that's you. Look at all of you on the screen. Mommy, hey, Bug. You're a good Buggy. She does. She's got the funniest look. She's got a little pit bull face. Look at her. She's her little pit bull kitty. You're like a little bulldog or something. Do I hold you while I read? Virginia, which was to become the hotbed of rebel revolt in 1776, was likewise concerned about seditious slaves and their allies. You're too cute. Bug, you're so cute. She's seen the duck. She's a little scared of the ducks. She's not allowed outside though. She's too little. Look at her. Only on her leash. Right, Bug? You're only allowed out on your leash. You're too little. She's just a little bug. You're comfy. The ducks definitely could do that, Bob, yes. Depending on the cat, she's good on the leash. She doesn't mind it. Are you comfy, Buggy? You're such a comfy bug. You were just such a comfy bug. Hey, Bug. Alright. You got a little bug break. Hey, Bug. Virginia, which was to become the hotbed of rebel revolt in 1776, was likewise concerned about seditious slaves and allies. In 1732, there were attempts to make more effectual provisions against invasions and insurrections, quote unquote. While by 1736, there were efforts to ensure better regulation of the militia so as to render it more powerful for preventing insurrection of slaves. A campaign deemed necessary since so many Negroes are brought into the country. As in neighboring Carolina, a tax was placed on the most valuable commodity, Africans, in order to assure that any of their potential insurrectional plans would be thwarted. The premise being that this would reduce the size of their population. That parishioners should take arms to worship on Sundays was mandated, a reflection of that time that Africans often chose to revolt and more than a Hail Mary, or more realistically, a Protestant prayer, ensuring that they would not do so. Virginia, being a locus of valuable commerce, was unable to avoid often disconcording commerce with foreigners. In mid 1735, leaders were considering business dealings with the slave depot that Brazil was becoming, a deal involving tobacco and other potentially lucrative transactions in both Europe and Africa. Ultimately, said William Gooch, this arrangement meant, quote, trade to Africa should be increased, unquote, the ultimate source of wealth. though the riches flowing into Williamsburg as a result were bound to attract the eager attention of Spain. It was also in 1735 that Gooch reminded London about the recent war with Spain, when a Spanish prize was brought to his domain that included several mulattoes and Indians said to be Spanish slaves, unquote, who may have been sold in his jurisdiction, though he conceded that their status was unclear. Such questionable sales involving the more pinched approach to color and slave status on the mainland often brought mainlanders into conflict with His Catholic Majesty, not to mention pushing the Milan and rich generally towards Madrid and St. Augustine. Want to go meet your friend's new kitty today, but you're waiting on a text back? Well, fingers crossed for you, comrade. By 1735, oh well, there you go. See, I tell you, weird things always align with the Leaping Larry stream as if I choose them, and they don't. It just happens when you're at the Leaping. All the more reason to hang out here. By 1735, London had begun to wonder if, perhaps, Virginians might want to elasticize their notion of privilege by emulating the Spaniards, as London would feel constrained to do so by placing Africans among the Redcoats, by expanding the franchise to include free Negroes and persons defined as mulattoes. This would erode an advantage held by Madrid, thus enhancing the viability of Virginia itself. London's man could not comprehend why one freeman should be used worse than another merely upon account of his complexion. Why strip these groups of those rights which are so justly valuable to every freeman, he wondered. Emphasis original. I didn't mean to leap on them so hard, Marge. It wasn't my intention. We leapt too hard. Gooch was dumbfounded, reminding of a conspiracy of late among those groups that the crown wanted to reward, designed to eliminate the settlement. Such plots, he pleaded, would forever be the case. Such was the insolence of the free Negroes at that time, he argued, that the next assembly thought it was necessary not only to make the meetings of slaves very penal, but to fix a perpetual brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes, well knowing that they always did and ever will adhere to and favor the slaves. Yes, this did seem to carry an air of severity, but slavery and colonialism were not for the faint-hearted. And in any case, as most of them are bastards of some of the worst of our imported servants and convicts, it seems no ways impolitic, is well discouraging that kind of copulation, as well as preserve a better distinction between them and their betters. Such disputes reinforce the settler perception that London was dangerously wobbly on the bedrock matter of persecution of the non-white, deepening the growing chasm between colony and metropolis, bringing permanent rupture ever closer. Mainland colonists were inviting disaster. They had been unable or unwilling to staunch the seemingly ceaseless flow of Africans to their shores, including those from rebellious Antigua, with demonstrated plans for mayhem in their hearts, who were joining those, notably in Carolina, who were of like mind. Antigua was a mighty shocked over the bow by the Africans, inducing others besides Abraham Redwood to contemplate abandoning ship, as it was apparent that Jamaica too, and perhaps the Danish Caribbean and Anguilla, and a spreading splotch of turbulence in the region, was jeopardizing the colonial project as a whole. and even allowing European competitors to oust London altogether. Carolina has been a designated firewall protecting Virginia and points north. But then the formation of Georgia was a damaging admission that a new firewall had to be constructed and extended further south to the border with Spanish Florida. But this was a poisoned chalice, since now London's subjects were ever closer to armed brigades of Africans, many of whom sought bloody revenge against these rapacious settlers. London was forced to defend a profoundly unsettled mainland with an unusual conception of patriotism that did not rule out intimate relations with the crown's bitterest enemies. In September 1739, what came to be known as Stono's Revolt in South Carolina exemplified the unavoidable fact that sterner measures would have to be manufactured in order to conquer those who were now routinely referred to as intestine enemies, Africans. And that is chapter 4 of our read complete. There you go. We studied. So I was also kind of thinking while we were reading this. I was thinking that perhaps what I could do as an alternative, once we finish this book, if what I was saying before, if I think it's going to be more if I think it's going to make more sense for me to, not do the reading just because of the amount of time and effort it takes, effort that I could, again,